You are listening to the Mother of All Talk Shows podcast with George Galloway.
Well, that was the week that was. It was the week in which Fireman Sam, the much-loved children's cartoon character, was banished from the force by fire chiefs who thought that he was too white and too male. Nothing wrong with that, I say, as a white male myself, in a country where 88% of the people are white and where half of them are males, but it does raise serious concerns for the fate of Noddy, the oldest and most loved of children's characters. Unless Noddy redefines himself as they rather than him or her, in the way that Sam Smith did this week. Now, let me say to Joe Biden, I play Sam Smith on my record player all the time. I think his voice came from God, is simply divine. I have zero interest in his sexuality, and I'm surprised that he thought that we did. Adam, Garrie and I were on a long drive this week, coming back from the Mother of All Talk Shows roadshow, and we came up with a few cover hits that he might cover for his next album. Thank You for the Days, the old Kinks number. Those were the days, my friend. You get where I'm coming from here, or rather headed to. This kind of absurd political correctness is alienating on this side of the Atlantic what has long been underway in the United States of America, where to be in with the in crowd, you've got to know your hims from your hers and your him and hers from the theys. The firefighter, and by the way, some of my oldest and closest friends are women firefighters, and I'd rather they came to rescue me than Fireman Sam. But firefighters are firefighters. It's not off-putting to women firefighters that Fireman Sam has something in his pants that defines him as a male. It's no more off-putting to young male explorers to enjoy the wonders of Dora the Explorer. If you're listening from far away and don't know any of these characters, perhaps you'll get it if I make this point. Last night, I was at a boxing event in Southampton, an overwhelmingly pro-Leave area. The audience, as is Southampton, was overwhelmingly white. The audience, as is the normal audience for boxing, was overwhelmingly male. And that's just the way things are. By forcing identity politics, political correctness, the policing of language, the policing of perception of one person of another, is doomed to alienate vast tracts of the population. And insofar as the left are identified as the champions of this kind of nonsense, the beneficiaries will be, as they have been in the United States, the political right. Just think about that. It was the week when the walrus, I am the walrus, John Bolton, was finally dismissed. The little Eggman who fomented war everywhere, war, famine, pestilence, and disease were his middle names. Donald Trump finally decided to give him the boot after a series of foreign policy disasters with China, with Venezuela, with North Korea, with Syria, and perhaps above all with Iran. Donald Trump's opinion poll ratings are on the slump. Donald, slump it is this week. Another 4 points of his public opinion poll ratings. Bolton's been given the boot, but he's not the last of the Mohicans in that administration. Pompeo was at it again today when the Yemenis struck back from years of relentless bombardment of their country, its hospitals, its schools, its wedding parties, even the funeral parties burying the people that were killed in the last airstrike. The Yemenis struck back at Saudi Arabia's principal oil terminals and set them on fire, causing a halving of Saudi Arabia's oil production. As Oscar Wilde said on the death scene of Little Nell, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh. So, the Saudis know the Yemenis can fight back. That's what any rational, sane person would say, before going on to say, let's try and bring this war to an end. But not Pompeo. He demanded that the United States find Iran guilty of the drone attacks on the Saudi oil refineries. And Lindsey Graham, who's never seen a war that he didn't like, though not enough to go and fight in it himself, has called for American airstrikes on Iranian oil refineries. Well, Mr. Trump, President Trump, if you do that, then you're an even bigger fool than most people already imagine you to be. And I spoke of Joe Biden earlier. Did you see the debates? Did you see his false teeth shooting out of his mouth and across the debating chamber floor? Did you see him in the previous debate when blood started to come from his eye? The balderdash between his ears remains intact as his long, utterly incoherent rambles, right-wing, reactionary rambles, continued to pour out of his mouth even after he lost his false teeth. I'm sorry, Joe, it's time to chuck it, and your family really ought to lead you away before the men and women, and they in white coats come onto the stage and lead you away themselves. Bernie, on the other hand, had another storming week and has broken into a massive lead in the opinion polls in New Hampshire, which has the benefit of being the state that will hold the first primary early next year in the Democratic Party process to pick their candidate against Donald Trump. I reiterate my oft-repeated take on this issue. If the Democrats pick Bernie Sanders, they can and will beat Donald J. Trump. If they pick anybody else, and particularly if they pick Joe Biden, they will be annihilated by Donald Trump. Speaking of boxing, the referee will have to intervene and stop the fight. The coaches in the corner will have to throw in the towel. Can you imagine Trump pulverizing that old man, Joe Biden, blood streaming from his eye, his dentures fleeing from his mouth, talking utter nonsense? I shudder at the very thought of it. And it was the week when Brexit went berserk here in Britain. The Liberal Democrats in the last 24 hours have declared themselves to be the opposite of Liberal and definitely the opposite of Democrats. They have passed a policy at their annual conference not to have a second referendum, to force the people to keep on voting until they vote the right way. No, that was their policy last week. This week, they're not even going to get a second referendum, just in case they fail to change their mind. The Liberal Democrats now are going to be the party to revoke Article 50 and forget all about this Brexit business altogether. Well, if you believe that, I've got a bridge here in London I can sell you. I've spent the last few days in the West Midlands, in Southampton, in a vast auditorium with hundreds and hundreds of working class boxing fans. If you think Brexit's going away, you weren't in the West Midlands with me, and you weren't in Southampton with me last night. But speaking of the West Midlands, the deputy leader of the Labour Party, deputy leader, somebody called Tom Watson, he made a speech this week which directly contradicted his own party, of which he is, I remind you, thrice the deputy leader, and absolutely contradicted, indeed kicked in the teeth. And Corbyn's teeth are real, I hasten to remind you. Not that I've pulled on them or anything, but I know him well enough to know he doesn't have a set of Joe Bidens in his mouth. Tom Watson kicked him in the teeth by saying that Labour should not support a general election for another 6 months. And in that 6 months, a second referendum should be held between Theresa May's Brexit deal, already dead and buried, which Labour under Watson would disinter and put back mouldering from its grave on the table, and have a new referendum between Theresa May's dead Brexit deal and remaining, with him as the deputy leader, Thornberry as the foreign secretary, MacDonnell as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Abbott as the Home Secretary, Starmer as the Brexit Secretary, are all pledged to campaign to remain. It's an odd way of living up to the manifesto promise which Labour successfully ran with in just 2017, scoring 40% in the polls. They're now down in the mid-20s at best. But in 2017, they promised to respect the result of the 2016 referendum, to respect the decision of the majority in that referendum, but merely to renegotiate the terms. That's what Corbyn wants to do, but all of his Confederates now, all of them, including his closest colleagues, MacDonnell and Abbott, who wouldn't get a chance of a sniff of a front bench under any leader except Corbyn, have joined the gang that seeks to break Brexit. And in so doing, and maybe for some of them that's the plan, break any possibility of Labour forming a government at an early general election. Because, you see, for many of them, not MacDonnell and Abbott, they would rather have Boris Johnson as Prime Minister than have their own leader, Jeremy Corbyn, as one. And, of course, the ghouls are out again today. I see in the Daily Mail that the sources in the British security services have warned Donald Trump that Jeremy Corbyn, PM, might leak secrets to the Russians. Why? Because he's a lefty? But Russia is not lefty. There's nothing left-wing about Russia. Russia ceased to be a communist country almost 40 years ago. What is wrong with these people? Why would Corbyn leak secrets in the first place? And why would he leak them to Russia? This kind of mania is going to grow and grow. And of course, it is assisted ably and utterly destructively by the fifth column inside the Labour Party as a whole, concentrated in the Parliament, in the Parliamentary Labour Party, now concentrated in his own shadow cabinet, and even now with MacDonnell and Abbott, jumping ships in his own kitchen cabinet, his own inner circle. Which leads me to Boris. The last story and this one confirm my long-held view that Britain is ruled not by James Bonds, but by Austin Powers, by Johnny English, by blithering idiots. Boris Johnson not only looks like a cartoon character, but has begun openly to liken himself to one. Today, he was going to break the shackles like the Hulk and come out swinging and fighting for Britain post-Brexit. But he forgot several things. First of all, that Mark Ruffalo, who plays the Hulk, hates him and was quick to point it out. Secondly, the Hulk is green and not blue. Thirdly, the Hulk is American and not British. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, the Hulk has a middle name, Incredible. The Incredible Hulk being played by the incredible Boris Johnson, who is running his campaign. They advised him to prorogue the Parliament, to stop the Parliament, trussing him up like a turkey and making a fool of him, tying his hands in his negotiations with the European Commission and its leaders. So he prorogued the Parliament and they trussed him up like a turkey anyway. There was ample time in the non-prorogued Parliament to wreck Boris Johnson's Brexit planning. So what was the point of the prorogation? What is the point of these walkabouts in northern towns where it seems people are queuing up to tell them to get out of their town? And I saw today, actually tears rolled down my face with laughter. Boris shambled up to a fortune teller, a gypsy fortune teller on a seafront somewhere, and asked her what her predictions for the future were, without anyone having checked what it was she might say as the cameras were rolling, rolling, rolling. Well, her husband said, actually our forecast is for a Labour victory at the general election. And just as Boris rocked back on his heels, he doubled down. He asked the woman, the fortune teller herself, what's your prediction? And she said, you've got a right cheek. You've stolen my pension. You've robbed this town of all prosperity. You've devastated us all with your austerity. And now you're asking for my fortune telling free of charge, without even offering a golden coin to pay for it. And then she confirmed her husband's crystal ball, that her official prediction was for a Labour victory. Well, there might be and there might not be. It all depends on whether Boris Johnson is as stupid as he looks and is acting. If Boris Johnson makes a pact with Farage and the Brexit Party, he will win the general election and win it very handsomely. But he has already rejected such a pact in the most insulting terms. And so the Brexit Party will be forced to oppose him in all but a handful of constituencies, in which case it becomes a four-party race in England. a 5-party race in Wales and a 5-party race in Scotland. In England, all 4 of the parties will be in the 20%, and it will therefore be the most unpredictable election in living memory. Actually, since Harold Wilson went to the polls in February of 1974 and won his 3rd of 4 terms as a Labour Prime Minister. And finally, it was the week when Julian Assange served out what was, in any case, a grotesquely unfair and long sentence for skipping bail, and where the court decided that he must remain in custody, perhaps for years, in Belmarsh prison, a maximum security jail, until the American case, an explicitly political set of charges of revealing American official secrets, Julian must continue to waste away in Belmarsh prison. Well, not if I can help it. I am absolutely committed to devoting as much of my time as I conceivably can to get Julian Assange out of jail. Now, John Shipton is a fine man, an Australian. I actually had the honour of meeting and spending time with him in Australia a few years ago when I visited Sydney on a small speaking tour. I never imagined when I met him some 5 years ago now that I'd still be having to talk to him, this time over the phone, alas, about the vile incarceration of his son, Julian Assange. And I hope he's joined me now on the line. John, are you there?
Yes. Hi, George.
Hi, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I said in my introduction that the decks are now cleared. Nobody has any excuse, if excuse there was, to support the incarceration of your son Julian. There are no charges in Sweden. The investigation into him there was long ago dropped. He's not in prison for having skipped bail. He's in prison for political charges. So, as Ambassador Craig Murray put it today, Britain now holds the world's #1 political prisoner. Am I right?
Yes, Julian has done nothing wrong. The British judiciary has pursued him. Judge Phillip, the first one, his judgment severely criticised by the Cambridge Law Review. Judge Arbuthnot, in her hysterical denunciation, saying he ought to get a bit of sun and step onto the veranda occasionally. Judge Phillips, who I suppose had a law degree but became a psychiatrist and gave a psychological evaluation rather than a judgment. And yesterday, the other day, Judge Barita, who decided to hear a bail application case which wasn't before her, which she promptly refused.
Who brought that bail application? It wasn't Julian's legal team.
No, Judge Barita made it herself.
So she adjudicated on a bail application that nobody made.
Yes, she made it up herself and then consequently refused it.
It's utterly farcical. And she made the point that Julian's calvary of all those years inside that embassy and now the requisite part of a 12-month sentence has cost the British taxpayer, taking into account the police costs and so on, £16 million. And so he must stay in Belmarsh and run up a bill, depending on how long the case lasts, of many times £16 million. Why?
Well, you know, I have no idea. Why the British judiciary is so seething with resentment of Julian is a question I can't answer.
I can't answer it either, and I'm British, and I have followed and studied this case in such great detail. It is an animus not even matched in the United States. There's a huge debate going on in the United States, in the media, in the political class, about the justice of extraditing Julian Assange in the first place. But in Britain, there's no debate at all. He's being held now only for the Iraq war logs and the Afghan war logs, which were a signal service to the world, revealing war crimes without number. And everyone who read those stories, everyone who published those stories, ought to be on the street with a Julian Assange banner. But they're not.
George, those officials who are engaged in administering the destruction of Iraq and Afghanistan occasionally pop up saying that Julian endangered lives, which he didn't, which is just a plain lie. But their obscenity of these officials involved in the murder of 1.5 million people, saying that this innocent man has been now restricted in freedom, the further restrictions, now solitary confinement, endangered lives. It's just beyond obscenity. No description for it.
You're right. Have you been able to see Julian in the prison?
Yes, I went 3 months ago, and he wasn't, you know, not in good order, but fighting fit, but you're suffering from torture, as Nils Melzer outlined.
He was the United Nations man, yeah?
Yes, yeah. Rapporteur on torture went and visited the prison with 2 experts who know how to look at a victim who's been tortured, a person who's been tortured, and he made a conclusion which was published, which the British government derided and said, oh, well, we're ignoring that. Similarly, the same way they ignored the WIGAD, the United Nations Committee on Arbitrary Detention, they similarly, when that declared that Julian was arbitrarily detained, they said, oh, well, we're not taking any notice of that.
Well, the Honourable former Ambassador Craig Murray pointed out something on that today of really momentous importance, and which should cause all British so-called journalists to hang their head in shame. This very committee of the UN set up to highlight cases of unjust and arbitrary incarceration, detainment of people, actually made a very forthright denunciation of the Iranian imprisonment of a British woman, a mother of small children, who is being unjustly held in Iran without proper trial. But the British media could not report that. Why? Because the same committee had said the same thing about your son, Julian. And they could not report a UN demand that Nazanin be released from Iran, because that same committee, so far as the British media was concerned, didn't exist, couldn't be allowed to exist, because if it did, you'd draw attention to their forthright demand for the release of Julian Assange. How about that?
Oh, that's just extraordinary. In February, they did a further review and launched another severe criticism of the British government, which was ignored. In fact, the British government participated in the dragging of Julian from the embassy against all conventions.
Indeed, they did. Now, bad as my own government is, what about your government? Julian is an Australian citizen. What has the Australian government, and public for that matter, done about one of their sons being treated in this way?
For the most part, they sit on their hands and they are complicit in their silence. I must say just that Julie Bishop raised the matter at parity with Jeremy Hunt and with Pompeo when she was foreign minister. That's the only time that the matter's been raised.
And is it an issue in Australia, in the print, in the broadcasting,
no.
in the political class at all?
No. In the political class, yes, but in the media, it's homogenous like the rest of the Western world. And only take opportunity to report when they have to.
And when you saw Julian, was he aware of the campaign around the world trying to free him? How isolated do you think he feels in there? Does he know what's happening in the world?
No, nothing. He's in his cell for 22 hours a day, and he goes to the Catholic Mass, which is 3 times a week, so that he can mix with other prisoners. Otherwise, he would be in his cell for 23 hours a day. It's just scandalous.
And no internet?
No internet, I think he got one library visit so far in the time he's been there.
One library visit?
No internet.
One library visit in what is effectively, what, 7, 8 months of jail?
Yes, and no opportunity whatsoever to prepare for Judge Barait's condemnation that you'll abscond. Nothing. There's just nothing.
Well, I mean, the way it's going, the British government will be conducting both sides of the case. They'll be putting up the arguments for Julian in order that they themselves can knock them down.
Yes, as Baraitsa did.
That's an extraordinary story, I must say.
They just think up things in the night and bring them to court.
And will there be an actual bail application? Can there now be? By Julian's defence team?
Of course they'll make an application. They don't want Julian. I mean, he's already been incarcerated for 9 years. This case will probably go for 3 years. That would be 12 years. For God's sake, the cruelty, it's just awful. 12 years, and they can't consider a bail application. The only bail application they consider is the ones they make themselves.
Extraordinary. And, I mean, finally, I mean, how, in a way, it's, I'm not sure even how to ask it, but how does it affect you? How does it affect his mother? How does it affect his children, his siblings? I mean, you've been all serving this sentence too, haven't you?
Well, his mother is, struggles with it and fights furiously. His children can't see him. His brother gets to see him once a year. His sister hasn't seen him at all. And I come, as frequently as possible. I come every Christmas, and I spend Christmas with him. Which is joyful, but a bit of a strain on both of us.
I've got a couple of questions here that viewers and listeners are sending in, John. George, could you ask John, please? This is from Dan. Could you ask John, please, about Satoshi Nakamoto? I don't know what that is, who that is, but you may.
That's the man who put together Bitcoin.
Bitcoin?
He's the originator of Bitcoin. That's all I know about Satoshi.
Okay. And Bird of Paradise, is he a friend of Julian?
Yes, back in 2010 they were corresponding.
Bird of Paradise, hello to Julian Assange's father. Your son is a great man. Hope you're doing well, sir. Well, I think we all can say that with our hands on our heart, John. We hope that you all survive this trial in every sense, literal and figurative. And your son is a great man. I have the honor to be a friend of his and to know him well and know his greatness well. And I hope that that is at least a scant consolation to you that people all over the world recognize your son as a great man.
Thank you, George. I'm quite moved by that. Thank you.
May God bless you. Thank you very much indeed for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Hellos from South Africa, Spain, the United States of America, Pakistan, the Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, Germany and Canada. Is that all, Elena? No other countries? Let's get... If you're listening anywhere else, let us know, will you, please? Tweets from Alistair Robertson. At the present moment, you're just going to have to accept that Northern Ireland, along with the rest of the UK, voted to leave the EU under the auspice of the UK. You might not be happy with that, but what are you going to do? Well, there's not much, Alistair, that I can do, but the Irish people can. And as you very well know, the majority of people in the 6 counties of the occupied north of Ireland voted to remain in the EU. I think they're wrong so to have voted, but they did vote that way. So rejoice, rejoice. A very simple solution, therefore, presents itself. As the Republic of Ireland strongly supports and claims that it strongly benefits from membership of the EU, and the majority of people in the 6 counties of the north of Ireland voted to remain in the EU, well, the solution is obvious, Alistair. They could reunify their country and all of them could enjoy, if that's the word, membership of the European Union as long as it lasts, which might not be as long as you think. Stuart Elson says, looks like it took Labour 45 minutes to come up with their latest Brexit plan. You'd need a cryptographer to fully actually interpret it. Roger Watson says, George, don't tell me that you think communism is good for people. Not sure what that question is even supposed to mean, Roger. I haven't mentioned communism at all in the course of this show. Fra Hughes says, as a fan of Corbyn, I cannot but feel he has delegitimised democracy by moving Labour into a second referendum stroke Remain party. I wouldn't vote for Labour this side of Brexit. Well, I'm not sure it's him that's moved. I think it's him that's been moved. His allies, shall I call them that, he said laughingly, have got their hands round his throat and have dragged him to wherever it is he is today, which isn't necessarily where the Labour Party is going to be tomorrow. It's people in motion, as Scott McKenzie used to say on my record player, Joe. Jude says, the English lied to the Scots in 2014. Let me just deconstruct that one, Jude. The English lied to the Scots in 2014. Did any of you through there lie to the Scots in 2014? Any of you English in there lie to the Scots? Wait a minute, I'm Scots. None of them lied to me. No English people lied to me in 2014, at least as far as I recall. The Promise didn't even... What are you talking about, Jude? You hopeless cause. Troy Astro says, I'm sick of hearing of Brexit. It will never pass. Well, A lot of people are sick of hearing of it, Troy. But until we get Brexit behind us, instead of forever in front of us, there will be no normal politics in this country. There'll be no Labour, Tory, no right, left, no taxation, spending, none of the normal politics that we have lived with, most of us, all of our lives, will be possible until this dichotomy, leave, remain, is resolved. And it can only be resolved by the implementation of the verdict that was given by the people in 2016. Wolfie Smith, power to the people, says, what's going on with your monologue, George? I thought you were a socialist. Wolfie, what does that even mean? What does it mean? Unless you're referring to Fireman Sam, are you? Do you think it's socialist to ban Fireman Sam because he's too white and too male? Do you? Do you think it's socialist to go around offending the English language by demanding that people refer to a singular as a plural? Is that what you mean by socialism, Wolfie? I suspect it is, actually. I suspect you think that socialism is liberalism, is identity politics, is sex, gender, race, anything but class, anything but the real class issues. The issue between the rich and powerful and the poor and powerless. That's the only identity politics in which I am interested. Wolfie, if you didn't mean any of that, do please call us. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Sami Ansari says, George, only you can expose the conspiracies against the humanity in the Parliament. Thank you, Sami, for that. Alexander says, Assange rots in prison while Blair roams free. Not just free, Alexander. He's far from free. He's exceedingly expensive, in fact. He's amassed £100 million personal fortune since leaving office just a decade or so ago. Go figure. Just think about that. Michelle Churchland says, the British legal system is so corrupt. Hashtag free Julian Assange. And Reeves Sleeveth says, the UK is a warmongering totalitarian state with a veil of tolerance and democracy. Let's take a caller. We got time? We got time, Elena? Let's go to Pennsylvania and talk to Jared. Jared, welcome.
Hello, George. I just got back from my vacation in Gettysburg. It was a lovely time visiting the battlefield there. There was just so much history. It was just great.
I'd love to do that, yes. I'd love to do that.
Oh, it was absolutely great.
Of course, Lincoln, and the Union defeated the racists there and then set off to the west to massacre hundreds of thousands of Native Americans. We mustn't forget that.
Yes, that's sort of the big irony of all of our history was that great moment when Lincoln used the Gettysburg Address to issue the Emancipation Proclamation to liberate all the slaves in the rebel territories, only for us to go forward and colonize the West, and along with overseas territories all around the world.
Yep.
And but it was a good experience.
Oh,
though.
Sure. I hope to do it one day. Anyway, how do you think the debates went this week?
The debates, ABC, these debates are truly horrible. You can see the bias by the, you call them fifth columnists in your country for the Blairites. I call them Vichy Dems, like Vichy France for Nazi Germany.
Yeah.
That's what I call the people opposing Bernie Sanders in this primary, because they didn't ask Bernie almost any questions. And when they did, it was about Venezuela. Claiming that Maduro is a dictator, not true. I didn't like Bernie's answer, but he didn't take the bait by calling him a dictator. He called him a tyrant, but I thought that was a bad answer. I thought it was a mistake on Bernie's part, but he didn't take the bait. And it seems like they're red baiting him, and you should.
You know, let me tell you something, Jared. I'm very rarely on what they laughingly call mainstream television anymore. I don't care. I've got my own radio and television platforms. But long before they stopped inviting me, I took the view that whatever the question was, I was going to give my answer. The answer that I had turned up at the TV studio to give. So if they sought to red bait me, my answer would bear no relationship to the question, because I had come to the studio to deliver messages 1, 2, and 3. And that's what Bernie Sanders should do. That's what Donald Trump does, and that's what won him the presidential election.
Yes, I agree 100%.
I would have said, never mind Venezuela, what about U.S. servicemen that are planning to kill themselves because they cannot afford a $140,000 bill for medicine and medical treatment for which they're not insured? Never mind Venezuela. Let's talk about America. That's what I would have said if I was Bernie Sanders.
I agree. I wouldn't have answered any of the questions. I thought the whole thing was propaganda. I would have brought up the fact that Trump blew up a peace deal with the Taliban, and that war is never going to end. It's on its 18th year. And I know for a fact, because I had a brother who was over in Jalalabad, Afghanistan, so just last year. So I know for a fact it's very much still going on, and it's still raging.
I think it was John Bolton that blew it up. We'll see if Trump reinflates it again. Jared, many thanks for the call. I've got to go to Peter in Manchester, England, I'm guessing. Peter.
Yes, hello, George.
Hello. Yes, go ahead, sir.
I'm a bit fed up with the criticism of Trump. I would say that it showed a certain maturity in hiring John Bolton, even if he didn't share the same beliefs as Bolton. As long as he had something to bring to the table, he hired him. And when he wasn't any good anymore, it showed decisiveness in firing him.
Okay, go on.
Well, it was your opinion I was after. I wanted to know, do you believe?
I think anyone who employs John Bolton is showing not maturity but imbecility, because absolutely no good can come from employing John Bolton and Elliot Abrams and Mike Pompeo. They are dedicated to the absolute opposite of what Donald Trump campaigned on in the presidential election and won on in the presidential election. Trump said, and I believe him, by the way, that he doesn't want America to be going around the world making war, nation building, occupying other countries. But Bolton and Pompeo, that's their meat and drink, Peter.
Yes, I believe. Just one more thing. Do you believe there are powers in the Democratic Party that would rather have Trump serve a second term than Bernie Sanders get the nomination?
I think almost all of the Democratic Party establishment are in that boat. Almost all of them. And that's why they're rigging this system before it's even begun. The reason why there's a list of Democratic hopefuls as long as your arm is not because the Democratic Party is bursting with talent, as we saw in the debates. It's because they need to force a second ballot at the convention. If there were only two candidates, two or even three candidates, somebody might win on the first ballot at the convention, and they can't have that. Why? Because only in the second ballot do their so-called superdelegates, where every member of the Democratic establishment has a shed load of votes in their pocket that they can then deploy. So, yeah, my answer to that one is definitely in the affirmative, Peter. Thanks very much indeed for the call. But I'm joined now by a very, very interesting man indeed. His name is Ron Unz. He turns out to be even more interesting than I thought that he was. Let me give you his background. He's a theoretical physicist by training. He serves as founder and chairman of unz.org, a content archiving website. He was for 6 years the publisher of The American Conservative, a small opinion magazine. He ran for office in California when he launched a surprise Republican primary challenge to the incumbent governor, Pete Wilson. And his campaign platform was a pro-immigrant platform. And against the prevailing political sentiment, he received 34% of the vote. He'll be joining us shortly. Some difficulties getting him on the line. So let me continue through the tweets that are flooding in. Remember to @ everyone involved, certainly @ George Galloway, @ RTUK. But also it would be helpful if it was at GG MOATS also. Now, where did I get to? I got to Reeve Sleeveth. Yeah, here's one for Ask Adam. Adam, I'm doing this one now so you get an hour to think about it before you join me. Is there any EU law that Boris and co can exploit to exit whatever happens on the 31st of October? I am joined now by my guest, born into, fascinatingly, a Yiddish-speaking household, a man of the right that is pro-immigration, a Jewish man who publishes Professor Norman Finkelstein, a Republican, a conservative, who gets over a third of the vote in California on a pro-immigrant platform. What's not to want to interview? Ron Unz is on the line now. I hope. Ron, are you there?
I'm right here.
I'm so glad that you could join us. I was anxious there when our first phone call didn't get through. Let me ask you, to get this out of the way, because I'm already getting some chaff on it. You're Jewish, grew up in a Yiddish-speaking household. You publish Norman Finkelstein, but according to Wikipedia, you're an anti-Semite. What's that all about?
Well, I mean, to be honest, Wikipedia is not the most reliable source.
Tell me about it. Tell me about it, yeah.
Right. And to be honest, I didn't grow up in a Yiddish-speaking household. My mother grew up in a Yiddish-speaking household. So, you know, I basically learned, you know, speaking English from a young age.
Yeah. Now, so there's, you're not anti-Semitic?
Well, I wouldn't probably say so.
Yeah, because that's what people are saying. Why are you interviewing an anti-Semite? Well, in the CV that I have, there's no reference to the fact that you're an anti-Semite. And I'm guessing that's because you are not one.
Well, again, it's not really something that's ever been characterized by me in, you know, the media. And I mean, to give you an example, it was about 15 or 20 years ago. I actually published the lead cover story in Commentary, which is the main publication of the American Jewish Committee. And there also was a very nice profile cover story of me in the New Republic, which, you know, is really a very heavily Jewish publication. So at least that was never the perception that I had from those sorts of sources.
Okay, let's press on to what it was I really wanted to talk to you about, because my eye was caught by the clarity, but also I think the bravery of your coverage of the Epstein affair, which flowered briefly here in Britain when the Ghislaine Maxwell angle became known, but has long now been buried, presumably with Jeffrey Epstein himself. Is this still a thing in the United States? Are people still talking about how it came to pass that the most interesting prisoner in the American prison system managed to commit the worst case of suicide anybody had ever seen?
Well, it's still getting a little bit of discussion and conversation, but to be honest, the media seems to be very eager to bury the whole case, for, a variety of reasons, some of which may be, less than honest. And it's certainly, a very embarrassing situation. The fact that the media essentially covered up Epstein's activities for 25 years. I mean, to be honest, when I'd sometimes seen some mentions of Epstein on the Internet, I sort of assumed it was just Internet nonsense. I mean, it really sounded in his activities something like a James Bond supervillain. And it just seemed to me very implausible that the American media would have covered up such activities if they were real. And then suddenly there were all these stories about him on the front page of the New York Times, repeating exactly the items that I'd never believed in. In other words, somebody having a private island, the largest mansion in New York City, stocked with underage girls that he provided to all of these very, very wealthy and famous people, including, for example, Prince Andrew. It just sounded too implausible to be remotely real. And then suddenly it was all on the front page of the New York Times.
Yes, the very circles that would have denounced the writings that you refer to on the Internet as conspiracy theories. But it turns out not only were these conspiracy theories actually true, but that the media that would have called them conspiracy theories covered them up.
Exactly. And the thing is, a lot of the articles I've been writing over the last couple of years deal exactly with that point. The massive volume of media cover-ups and media suppressions of enormously important stories in recent years and, to be honest, recent decades. And basically there's a clear pattern of this sort of thing. And it seems to me the most important thing we should really take away from the Jeffrey Epstein case is the fact that the media, the Western media, is extremely unreliable. And we just have to be very, very careful before we believe any of its reports on a whole range of touchy and controversial issues.
And so, is that why you've gone basically back to being a publisher yourself? And that's, I must tell you, on a very much smaller scale than you, that's exactly what I have done. I see no virtue or purpose in sending out press releases to what calls itself the mainstream media, because they'll ignore them, cover them up, and insofar as they ever publish anything, they'll distort and twist the points that are being made. So is that what you're doing with the UNS report?
That's exactly correct. In other words, I started the UNS Review a few years ago for exactly that reason, and really primarily to provide a potential venue for my own writings. But I realized that so many prominent writers, people of really tremendously high caliber, had been purged from the mainstream media over the years, that there was a potential opportunity to provide a useful platform for all of those individuals, individuals from the left, individuals from the right, individuals from a more libertarian direction, individuals whose ideological views can't easily be characterized. But in all those cases, because they stood for views that the media did not like, they were purged from their traditional sources, and it really would be very useful to offer them a combined platform. And also, the truth is, on a lot of these controversial issues, many individuals who normally would be characterized as being on the right sometimes find themselves quite close to individuals who would be characterized as being on the left. And that's because many of them are willing to stand up for what they feel is the truth rather than bend with the prevailing winds that, many times determine what the media says.
Yeah, one such case, I've just been talking before you on the show to John Shipton, the father of Julian Assange. He's another case in point, isn't he? He was someone who was once the toast of the celebrity leftist glitterati, chatterati classes, and then was dropped like a hot brick, and now languishes in Belmarsh prison, now indisputably for the Iraq war blogs and the Afghan war blogs. He has no other charges, only those. And no one, not even the deep state in the US, claims that what he published was untrue. So he's in prison and has been without liberty for almost a decade for publishing that which was true.
That's exactly correct. In other words, we have somebody, just as you say, who was really lionized by the media and the liberal establishment around the world for a few years, and then suddenly they all turned against him, simply because he continued to hew to the truth rather than to follow, the prevailing tides of elite opinion. And it's really, there are so many cases like that, that the volume, once somebody starts digging into the history of the media and the number of prominent individuals over the last 50 or 60 or 70 years who've been purged from the media on ideological grounds, it really becomes a shocking tale. And sometimes, for example, the media switches positions. In fact, in your country, I was just looking at that earlier this morning. For example, a fairly prominent leftist figure in the Labour Party of Britain, Ken Livingstone, who, I've been reading about for many, many years, in fact, who goes back decades, a couple of years ago was purged from the Labour Party simply for pointing to the existence of the Nazi-Zionist economic partnership of the 1930s. And that's a perfectly documented, well-known historical fact that, in fact, was reported in the Times of London. And so when somebody simply quotes the Times of London from the 1980s, but does so in 2015 or 2016, he's denounced by the media and purged from the Labour Party, which is just completely ridiculous.
Yes, and of course, if you had all night, I could give you dozens of other similar stories. But Mr. Livingstone was the first, and he was the most prominent victim of this witch hunting of people for telling what no one can dispute as the truth. You might argue about the good taste of raising something. You might argue about the political efficacy of raising something. In this time at that platform. You can argue all that. But none of these warrants the actual expulsion and the extinguishing of your political identity because what you said was true.
Exactly, and reported by the Times of London. You can't get a more establishmentarian source than Britain's most famous newspaper.
Yes, it's not quite what it was, Ron, I've got to tell you, but yes, you're right. In the past, it was the Journal of Record. Speaking of records and record players, is it really serious that Joe Biden, with his teeth flying out across the debating hall and blood coming from his eye and talking in the arcane language of the 1970s that he seems now still to live in, is he really going to be Donald Trump's opponent come the election? And if he is, Trump's going to romp home, isn't he?
Well, it's difficult to say what will happen in the Democratic primaries. There's obviously a lot of time to go. And I think there's a reasonably good chance that a couple of the other candidates, like, for example, Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, might end up getting the nomination. But, certainly Biden is one of the, is right now ahead in the polls. So there's certainly a good chance that he'd be the opponent. And if he is, I think I tend to agree with you that Trump would have a much easier time against him than against, one of the other candidates.
Solve this conundrum for us, Ron. You're a very intelligent man. Your IQ is reportedly 214. And I left school at 17 to go and work in the Michelin tire factory. So help me with this. Who is the real Donald Trump? Is it the Donald Trump who campaigned for election as a man who was going to reindustrialize the Rust Belt, was going to end America's involvement in unjust wars, was going to stop being quote-unquote nation builder, was going to reset relations with Russia? And is that the real Donald Trump? And was it that Bolton and co. Prevented the real Donald Trump from coming forward, in which case presumably we'll see a different Donald Trump in the next 12 months? Who is the real Donald Trump in your view? Is he left? Is he right? Is he stupid? Is there method in his apparent madness?
Well, I've never personally met him, but my strong impression of him is that the real Donald Trump is sort of a celebrity type, and a fairly ignorant celebrity. In other words, if you took some television celebrity and suddenly gave them enormous political power, they probably wouldn't really know what to do with it. And they'd probably end up relying on various different advisors who temporarily won their opinion on something. So I think the problem is, when Donald Trump ran for office, I don't think he really had a very good idea of what he wanted to do. And as he then came in, his original advisors, who had one set of views, were very quickly purged by the Washington, D.C. establishment. And some of them, in fact, are facing prison sentences right now. And so they were then replaced by advisors who were really much closer to the neocon Republican Party that Donald Trump had run against. In other words, many of the things Donald Trump has been doing in office are exactly the things he denounced the establishment Republican Party for supporting when he defeated them in the primaries.
Indeed so, yeah.
And it isn't clear to me whether Donald Trump even recognizes that he's changed his views on those issues. I mean, some people have clearly defined political beliefs. Other people don't really pay much attention to politics. And I think Donald Trump falls into that second category. And, it's easy for someone like that to be moved around by whomever they happen to be most recently listening to.
Was it Bernard Shaw who said that someone was a sofa who bore the impression of the last person to sit on them? I'm not making any allegations about people sitting on Donald Trump. I quickly add, what about you now, Ron? Have you given up running for office? You did pretty well when you did run.
Oh, well, actually, that was a long time ago. And the thing is, I was very concerned at that point over the direction the California Republican Party was taking on immigration issues. And as it is, I think I played a role in helping to sort of avert some of that. And as it is, things really worked out quite well in California. And California right now is doing probably better than most other parts of the country. So, I think domestically, America has severe economic problems right now. But my main concern is really on the foreign policy side, with really what amounts to an insane foreign policy in most recent administrations, and really in many ways continued by Donald Trump, and aimed against Russia, aimed against China, aimed against Iran. And, things like that could get very, very dangerous for the world if they're continued. And that's why, to be honest, I was very willing to support Donald Trump, not because I was tremendously impressed with him personally, but because it seemed to me at the time that Hillary Clinton and some of her views about a military intervention in Syria against the Russian troops there were potentially extremely dangerous for the world. So, the best you can say about Donald Trump is he hasn't actually started a major war yet, and he's been in office for a couple of years.
Well, that's right.
And I just hope that continues.
Well, I put it at the time, having predicted, I may say, that Trump would win, that I'm not happy that Donald Trump is the president, but I'm very happy that Hillary Clinton isn't. And I think that's been borne out by the lack of war making by Trump over the first part, at least, of his first term, maybe his only term. Ron, how do people read your stuff? It's the UNS Review, is it?
Exactly. It's basically UNS.com. It's a website that provides a very wide range of alternative perspectives, both from the left and the right, and from really views that don't fit in one way or the other. And, you know, in a sense, we really have gotten quite a lot of traffic over the last few years. In fact, we've passed now The Nation and the New Republic in terms of daily readership, which is just astonishing. I never would have expected when we got started.
Well, I'm going to look at it tonight when I get home. I'm sure a lot of people listening and watching will do the same. Pleasure to make your acquaintance, Ron. Thanks very much for joining us. Now, how could I resist my next guest? He's a Scotsman from Fife, just across the water from where I was born, and I mean a very narrow piece of water, the River Tay. He came from Fife, but he now lives in considerable style near Las Vegas. How so? Because he has become exceedingly rich, not at the gambling tables of Las Vegas, but by being the #1 ethical hacker. You remember that Leonardo DiCaprio film where in the, I think it's called Catch Me If You Can, where he ends up offering his tremendous hacking abilities to corporate America so that they can guard against people like him. Well, in a way, that's what Mark Litchfield does. He is a brilliant hacker, totally brilliant hacker. And he does so for ethical reasons. And he gets well paid for it. What's not to love? Mark Litchfield, are you there on the line, son?
Yes, I am, sir. How are you doing?
Which part of Fife are you from?
So I'm actually from Arbroath.
From Arbroath, that's even better. It says Fife here. I used to go swimming in the outdoor swimming pool in Arbroath.
Yeah, they shut that down a long time ago.
It's very cold. It was very, very cold. I've even played football at I've even played football at Gayfield. So there you are. You're from Arbroath.
So did I.
So from how did you get? Tell us from Arbroath to Las Vegas, and what happened in between?
Okay, quick version.
Yeah.
I went from Arbroath to London, did a job, set up a company with my brother, sold the first one, then we set up a second one, then we moved, I moved over to the US because we were getting a lot of work from Microsoft, set an office up over there, and then we got acquired, and I came back to Scotland, then I went back to Seattle, and from, well, I met my wife at that point, and because I worked remotely, she said, let's go to Vegas. I was like, okay, let's go.
It's certainly not cold in the open-air swimming pool in Las Vegas. That's for sure. It must be the hottest place in America.
Right now, I have absolutely no idea what it is, but the sky is blue, extremely blue, and it's very hot.
Now, tell me about this ethical hacking. How did you get into that?
Well, I started off the traditional way, just teaching myself, and then, how can I put it? I learned about this thing called bug bounty, and Yahoo launched this bug bounty program, and I thought, hey, let's give it a shot. So I did, and I found a bug. I submitted it. I just wanted to test the water, you know, see if this is all like legit. So I did, and didn't hear anything back. Then 6 weeks later, I got an email from this company called HackerOne, who I'd never heard of at this point. And they said, hey, we've got like $2,700 for you. Do you want it? I was like, yeah. And so I was like, damn, that could be money made in this. And it started from there.
And how far has it gone? I mean, do people come looking for your services?
Well, no, they don't. And the reason why they don't have to, well, actually that's a lie. I have done it for some companies, but bug bounty has grown so tremendously right now. To begin with, it was seen as like a fad. It was like a joke. But now there's so many companies involved in bug bounty that you can literally go online and sign up to HackerOne, BugCrowd. There's a load of companies out there that are offering a lot of money if you can find like decent bugs there.
Yeah, I mean, it's millions, yeah? 19 million was awarded last year to ethical hackers like you.
Yeah, and, well, so I was at a live event where Verizon Media paid out $1 million in one night.
Okay. Well, I hope you got a decent share of it.
Sure.
Of course, for every ethical hacker, there'll be several unethical hackers, won't there? People who are effectively criminals. What's the ethical hacking community's attitude to the unethical?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So the only way I would turn this around is if you consider you have 1,000 white hats looking at a particular target versus one black hat looking at a target, and that black hat has already found a hole, these 1,000 other white hats will eventually find that one hole that the black hat found and then report it and get paid for finding that issue. And now you could essentially say the internet is safer, and that black hat's hole is now being closed down. Mm-hmm. And when I'm talking about a black hat hole, I'm talking about a foreign state.
Well, is it foreign states or is it thieves and the mischievous? Because they always try and blame it on a foreign state, don't they? But it's not always. Well, it's often private individuals.
Yeah. Correct. Absolutely correct. But it depends what the target is. Let's say it's Lockheed Martin. Now, if I was a foreign state, I would be going after not their database of customers. I'd be going after their research and development, where they've spent billions of dollars, and now I can immediately steal that, and I've just got all that research, God knows how many years of research, and I instantly own it. Mm-hmm. So that would be a classic China.
Yeah.
Then you have the other types of attacks, which is the ones you're referring to as the ransomware. But ransomware isn't really, that's not hacking. That's just sending like a link to someone's email where they click on it and they've basically exploited themselves.
Okay, but what about all this malarkey of interference in elections and so on? You're now in America. America has been, until the Mueller died a death a few months ago, the United States was entirely fixated with the idea that Vladimir Putin had hacked their election, but he didn't.
Okay, I'm not going to proclaim to be an expert in this.
Okay.
I would suggest Alex Stamos would be a good person to talk to. I know him, he's a great guy.
Yeah, put him on. We'll put him on the show next week. So what's
okay.
How does the future look for you, Mark?
The future look great.
Are you going to stay there in the U.S.?
Yep. Actually, today I packed up my house. I'm moving. I'm going to Hawaii.
Okay.
I had to leave Vegas, and I bought a bar. And I'm still going to keep hacking, doing what I do.
You bought a bar in Hawaii?
That's the life of a bug hunter. Yeah, I get the keys on the 1st of October.
I can't tempt you back to Arbroath then?
No chance.
God bless you and your wife. Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for coming on the mother of all talk shows. Adam, I gave you notice of Ian Puddock's question, but let's broaden it a little. On the face of it, Boris Johnson is heading for complete disaster. He appears set on a course that cannot possibly prevail and could end in him going to prison, maybe even next to Julian in Belmarsh, though I suspect they'd find a feather pillow for him.
I think more Nawaz Sharif than Julian Assange.
Yes.
Not that it will happen.
Yes. So he must have something up his sleeve. Or he really is an idiot. Does he have something up his sleeve? What could it be?
Well, he'd better have something up his sleeve. The issue in English law, which let's have a bit of that for a change, is a matter of parliamentary supremacy versus royal prerogative. Now, the short version of the difference between the two is as follows. If there's something that is singular and permanent, it is generally the charge of royal prerogative. If it's something ongoing and manifold, it tends to be the kind of thing dealt with by Parliament, an issue in which Parliament is supreme. For example, foreign affairs are generally the reserve of royal prerogative. That means the Queen and Parliament, which in the real world means the Prime Minister and the government, gets to make foreign treaties. The Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords
cannot make treaties.
No, they didn't go to Versailles to end the Great War. And one of the areas that we can test where royal prerogative applies is this. There doesn't need to be an enforcement mechanism to end a war. Once the Great War is ended, you can't restart it. You can fight a second war, but you can't restart the first. Where for something like, let's say, if we have a hat tax, where anyone who wears a hat needs to pay a new tax, I shouldn't give any of these people ideas. But one would need to set up a mechanism to enforce it and then to tax people like me who aren't wearing a hat to punish us if we refuse to pay. And so, because it's an issue of foreign affairs, if this so-called Ben bill, and the irony of the author's surname shouldn't be lost on anyone, since Mr. Hilary Benn's father, Tony Benn, was one of the great Brexiteers of all time, even though the term hadn't been invented. The legal argument that Johnson would have to deploy, if it comes to a standoff in court, is that the government, which is to say the Queen, cannot be bound by an act of Parliament in future foreign relations, because this would effectively bind the government from, it would prohibit the government from exercising certain rights and privileges that it has in making foreign treaties. And this would be a real showdown, because the Queen is supreme, but so is Parliament. Rarely do they clash, but this could be the mother of all clashes.
There wouldn't be much time for a crisis, because we'll not know what Johnson is going to do until he goes to Brussels for the European Council meeting. I think it's on the 17th.
Yes, 17th of October.
And we're ineluctably bound to leave, absent any other mechanism, on the 31st. So that's only 14 days. That would require an epic Supreme Court battle to be done, dusted and adjudicated, all within 14 days. And now the wheels of justice grind exceedingly fine, but they also grind exceedingly slow.
Yes, quite right. And this Supreme Court, another ghastly invention of Tony Blair, who took away the power of the law lords to adjudicate in the same way, according to the common law, but in an existing ancient institution of Parliament. It will be a matter of them perhaps having to decide ex post facto. He may well have already taken Britain out of the EU using his royal prerogative as given to him by the Constitution, and then the court would have to decide in the aftermath of that. Getting back to the other question about EU law, it gets even more murky, because EU law is a minefield, and anyone who passes it gets a big kiss on the lips from Angela Merkel or Guy Verhofstadt or any of them in the EU. But there are two ways, and it's quite esoteric, but we're in esoteric times, legally speaking, two things that could be legally deployed for Johnson in his corner. The first would be the Lisbon Treaty. The Lisbon Treaty specifically states, and this is the EU Constitution under a misleading name. It states
they changed this name because it was defeated as a constitution.
Quite right, in referenda.
In referenda in more than one country.
Indeed, and so rather than accept the vote, they just said, right, it's the same document, but we're going to call it something that seems a bit less monolithic. In any case, that document says that within 2 years from the day that a member of the EU decides to invoke Article 50 in order to prepare for a withdrawal, that country must withdraw from the Union. Therefore, Johnson could say, I must disobey the Benn Bill, which demands that the government asks for a extension, because that would be asking for something illegal. And it is perfectly right to refuse to obey legal orders. It might get you kicked out of the Labour Party, but it would bode well for someone at the Nuremberg trials. And so it's an esoteric argument in EU law, but he could make that without prejudice to what Mrs. May and the others have already done. Then there's a second issue which would invoke both European law and English common law, and that would be to say, since the European Council of Ministers is the forum in which Britain and the EU negotiate, it isn't for Parliament to interfere in that two-way relationship between one government and the 27 other governments. Do I think those EU law arguments will work? No, because the EU has a very clever way of disregarding its written constitution whenever it wants, a bit like what America unfortunately does. I think the arguments in English law about parliamentary supremacy versus royal prerogative in foreign affairs, that's going to be the crux of the issue, unless some very clever government barrister can poke some specific holes in the Benn Bill, which would then, it would take away the necessity of having to go to this constitutional argument.
How very interesting. Now, I need to correct, the tickets for Liverpool are from Ticket Quarter, although it says on that screen Ticket Quater, Ticket Quarter. But this can all easily be resolved if my friends through the glass can bring me a piece of paper with the details, all the details of our Liverpool roadshow. Let's take our first caller, though, to Adam. It's James in London. James, welcome.
Oh, hello, George. How are you?
Good, thank you very much. Thanks for the call. Go ahead.
Yeah, a very simple thing, and you know, you're certainly a more learned and educated man than me. I just wanted to know why, when the media talks about Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, they talk about Marxism.
Yeah.
And why not? I mean, nobody seems to talk about Marxism. I mean, is there any reference historically where these kind of principles work? I think is Venezuela not the most recent example of the disaster of these principles? I look at these people as lunatics. I think Jeremy Corbyn is an extremist.
Really? I don't actually think any of the three parties to whom you referred there are Marxist. I'm certain that Jeremy Corbyn is not a Marxist, and I'm pretty sure that John McDonnell, though he once was one, is no longer. As to whether Venezuela is guided by Marxism, again, I doubt that. I think that Venezuela is more southern than left. It's more Latin American than left. It's a bit like how they used to describe, you know, Vietnam and so on. Vietnam's struggle against the United States had nothing to do initially with communism or Marxism. It was a struggle for national independence against a big power seeking to subjugate it. And I think rather that Venezuela is in the same boat. Neither do I believe that you're correct when you infer that socialist politics is what has brought Venezuela low. What has brought Venezuela low is the determination of the United States to destroy the Venezuelan revolution, which was, as you recall, led by Hugo Chavez. But let me take more philosophically your main point. The British Labour Party has never been Marxist. It famously was said that it owed more to Methodism than Marxism. And I think that Jeremy Corbyn is far more analogous to Michael Foot than he is to Vladimir Lenin. And by the way, on the Brexit issue, Mr. Corbyn had identical views to Mr. Foot, but not because they were Marxist. Adam, pitch in.
Well, I think the biggest problem with the Labour Party is its dysfunctionality. I'm totally anti-ideological myself. I don't have an ideology. I go with what works. I believe in pragmatism, and there's very, very little of that. Frankly, in either party, it's as if both parties are competing to see who can muck it up the most. But in general, we're living in in an age where cheap and easy rhetoric is flying everywhere. Yeah. So anyone to the right of Vladimir Lenin is called a Nazi, and anyone to the left of Tony Blair's right pinky finger is called a Marxist or a commie or the rest of it. I'm really not interested in any of these labels. If a politician is successful, it's because the economy grew rather than shrunk, employment increased rather than decreased, crime went down rather than up, war decreased rather than increased, terrorism decreased as well. These are all the kinds of tests I would use. So you look when there's an opposition party whose leader hasn't been in government before, you have to just ask, are these policies going to work, yes or no? I think Emily Thornberry gave the world that answer a few weeks ago.
James, last word to you, my friend. James, are you still there? Oh, what a pity. James did give you the right of reply. I'm sorry we lost you. Let's go to Louisiana in the United States. Talk to Patrick. Patrick, welcome back.
It's great to hear your voices, gentlemen. Always a pleasure.
Likewise. Thank you, Patrick.
And thank you. I wanted to call about the dastardly love child of a walrus, otherwise known as John Bolton. With his departure, do you think that his replacement could potentially be just as bad, if not worse, than he? Or do you think Trump will pivot possibly and go in a different direction?
Well, I mean, we'll ask Adam. He knows, he follows these things a bit more closely than me. He even knows this guy that wasn't in the Eagles but is running for president against Trump. But my view is that it would be hard to find someone worse than John Bolton, number one. And number two, that Trump would be exceedingly foolish to go looking for one. It seems to me that particularly the trade war, actually, that he's fighting with China is now beginning to hurt him electorally in quite a serious way. So he needs to de-escalate the foreign policy confrontations that he is now in. And he cannot do that by appointing another John Bolton. Adam.
Well, I agree with you, Phil. You can't really get worse than John Bolton unless he appoints Tony Blair as his national security advisor and appoints John Bolton the peace envoy to the Middle East. But barring such a horrific Friday the 13th scenario, I think, to quote Tony Blair's favorite song, things can only get better. I think that Trump has always been sincere when he's about big money rather than big war. He's about a Gulf war with a golf club, as opposed to Gulfs of Tonkin and Gulfs of Persia and the rest of it.
We're patenting that one.
Absolutely.
Trump is more Gulf War than Gulf War.
It's a bit of a tongue twister, but you know the meaning superlative. But yeah, I think that it'll be interesting to see who he picks. If it were me, I would put Senator Rand Paul in, the son of the greatest American president there never was, Dr. Ron Paul. But there have been there's a person called McGregor. His first name slips my mind, but he's given speeches that are very much in line with this non-interventionist, pragmatic view that Trump has voiced. We'll know when we know, but there's also been voices that have said that the role of National Security Advisor might be reduced, as it frequently is. The most powerful in recent memory was, of course, Brzezinski, who guided Jimmy Carter's foreign policy very poorly, I might add. And then, of course, there was Henry Kissinger before him, who at one point was both Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He was a very powerful fellow. I think what we'll see now is a reduction in the influence of that particular role and an increase in Pompeo's influence, which will make some people shudder, and I can understand why. But what all Pompeo is, he's a neocon because he can't really afford to be anything else. He hasn't got the creativity for peace, but he's a yes man. And at the end of the day, he wants to keep Trump happy. He wants to keep his job. He'll go along with the flow. Where the walrus John Bolton swam against the current, and now he's been released back into his natural habitat, which is somewhere between an A-bomb and an H-bomb, I should think.
Brilliant. Patrick, last word to you.
Well, I totally agree, Adam. I'm hoping that it will be a non-interventionist, like a Senator Rand Paul. Though, you know, with this administration, you never know. So yeah. I certainly don't intend to get my hopes up.
No, we'll not bet our houses on it, Patrick. That's if I had a house to bet. Patrick, thank you very much indeed for that call from Louisiana. Let's take a call from Tony in the aforementioned Liverpool. Tony, welcome.
Good evening, George. Good evening, Adam.
How are you?
My question is related to the Brexit scenario still, George. I was just going to touch on the point. We, as far as I'm still aware, we do have a veto. And at the impending EU summit, can Boris Johnson, does he still have it within his power to use the veto, to actually veto the Ben bill? And at previous EU summits, did Theresa May have that veto right herself, and did she just choose not to exercise that veto?
Well, it's a very good question. Of course, that could be the rabbit that he has up his sleeve, but there are two issues. First of all, you'll recall on Theresa May's last hapless, ill-fated visit to negotiate with the EU, they kept her waiting outside, even eating outside. They made her dine alone. And sit outside while they were deliberating about us. They did not allow her into the room. Now, I suppose theoretically you could try and force a court judgment in Europe that granted us our right to be there and the use of our veto. But perhaps a larger problem is that if he did go to Brussels and do that, he would clearly not just have ignored the Ben bill, I hate to call it that, but he would have blown it up. He would have literally taken proactive steps to contradict and destroy what is now an act of Parliament with royal assent. Adam.
Well, if Emily Thornberry becomes a judge on the European Court of Justice, then quite, you know, the pensions and all that, then perhaps Boris could veto his own requests, because Thornberry, of course, wants to veto her own negotiations should she ever get near power. Let's hope she does not, speaking for myself only there. Most legal experts, though, agree that you can't veto something that you yourself have suggested, and the other legal argument there is when you're giving a request, you don't really have any power over how that request is granted. You're asking someone else for something. You're not asking yourself to do something in the proactive sense. Frankly, what should have been done, if I were Boris Johnson, I would have called off the prorogation and then made Parliament vote on a repeal of that act of constitutional vandalism created by the used car salesman Nick Clegg and his best buddy Dave Cameron, called the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. And if you repeal, you could repeal that with a simple majority. Not necessarily that easy for Boris to get, but far easier than the impossible 3/4 majority necessary to call a snap election under that act. If he were to muster that 50.1% of the Parliament behind the repeal of that act, then he could just go to the Buckingham Palace and ask the Queen to dissolve the Parliament, like what Justin Trudeau just proverbially did in Canada, or what Netanyahu did in Israel, or any other normal sense of Parliament parliamentary democracy that hasn't been destroyed by Dave and Nick. That's what I would have done. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. But I'll say something else, because I think it's quickly worth saying. The biggest enemy to Brexit isn't the Lib Dems, it isn't Labour, it isn't the 21 who have been kicked out of the Tory party. It's Dominic Cummings, Boris Johnson's right-hand man, who's hated famously by people like Gina Miller and John Major, but he's also someone who's said incredibly nasty things about the true architect of Brexit, Nigel Farage. He was one who was a soft Brexiteer from the beginning, and he's someone who's openly not openly, but he is prohibiting this Brexit alliance between all MPs and all parties who support Brexit, which nominally would be the Brexit party of Farage, the Conservative party of Johnson, and people like Kate Hoey on the Labour side, like others on the left, centre, and those who previously had no affiliation. Cummings is an egotist, and I really think because of that he's giving Boris some very bad suggestions, and the proof is in the pudding. Things are looking bad. The brilliant plan has backfired spectacularly.
Now, it's in court on Tuesday, isn't it?
I believe so, yes.
In the Supreme Court.
Not this issue, but the prorogation issue will be in court on Tuesday.
Why did he bother with prorogation? Because the Parliament has done its worst anyway.
Quite
in
so.
the time it had available left.
He's getting really bad advice. If he was going to prorogue Parliament, just prorogue it through the 31st. But he didn't do that. He gave them enough time to sabotage what he wanted, but not enough time to do what I would have done, which is to try to attain a simple parliamentary majority to throw out the Fixed Term Parliaments Act that would let him then dissolve Parliament and call an election.
You know, in this very building, Peter Mandelson set about the modernisation of the Labour Party. I was in favour of modernising the method, just not modernising the content.
Yes.
But the modernisation of the method was very impressive. I know that because I was a Labour Party official under Michael Foot, and I was a Labour Party Member of Parliament when these people came to power. So I could see, compare and contrast. Now, in this very building, Mandelson and co. would have considered it anathema. Someone would have been fired for allowing the Prime Minister to approach a fortune teller on a seafront with cameras in tow without knowing what the fortune teller was going to say. Even cross her palm with silver in order that she doesn't embarrass you. But she utterly humiliated Johnson. Who's running that show? I asked myself today.
I mean, if it were Mandelson and Campbell in charge, they would have probably planted someone, dressed them up like a gypsy, and then say, well, I think that Mr. Blair is modernising the country, and I think he's the greatest thing since a sliced crystal ball. And this whole thing, it is looking a bit chaotic. It makes the early months, and mind you, that was even more chaotic than now, the early months of the Donald Trump White House looked like the Politburo of the Communist Party of China.
Compared to this, yeah.
It's really, and I personally, I admit, I'll lay my own cards on the line. I don't like Cummings because I don't like his views about Brexit that he expressed in 2016. I don't like how he's attacking the golden goose of Brexit, which, love him or hate him, is Nigel Farage. And just look at what's if this is your great, brilliant strategist, if this is your Rasputin, then he's not really doing much good, whether it's the fortune teller or whether it's lacking the very foresight to realise that if you give Parliament a few days before prorogation, they're not just going to sit there praising John Bercow. They'll do that, but they did other things too.
Exactly. So, Tony, thanks for the call. Max is in Surrey. He's on next. Go ahead, Max.
Good evening, John. Good to do your great show again. I think you should be on more often, actually, but
yeah.
It's the same, I miss you sometimes. Quick question. So in India, they recently removed the status for 1 million people to be Indian citizens, and this particular policy disproportionately affects the Muslim population. So that's been going on for a while, and the official register now has removed approximately about 1 million people. Today, I was reading on RT that Modi is opening a concentration camp for non-citizens. I'm just curious what Adam thinks will be the crunch points for some kind of international intervention, because the current Hindu party is becoming the Nazi party.
Well, of course, Adam will answer for himself, but let me be absolutely clear. Armed intervention against India is not going to happen, should not happen, would be catastrophic were it to happen. I'm not in second place to anyone in my feelings about Mr. Modi. But at the end of the day, India is an independent country. It has a government that was re-elected with an increased majority very recently, and unfortunately it's using that parliamentary power to really cut a swathe through all that was good about India in the past. Adam, you're an expert on India. Give us your view.
Well, I'm in 100% agreement with that. I think that the BJP, Modi's party, it's an absolute abomination, but it's only going to fall from within. He's had some scandals, but that didn't affect the election for the reasons that you just explained. But India is fast becoming a prison of nations, which was, of course, the term that was used about the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s. And before that, Lenin actually said that about Russia. Lenin was, of course, very wrong. Russia was never a prison of nations. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, well, we'll leave that for another day. But India's becoming a place where a northern clique, so states like Uttar Pradesh, states like Gujarat, this so-called cow belt, the Hindi belt, is essentially creating several apartheids within one. Sikhs are being suppressed. Assamese are being suppressed. The entire South is essentially being ignored and treated like a foreign country. And Muslims are being attacked outrageously in India proper, which is to say nothing about the occupation turned violent annexation of Jammu and Kashmir. Dalits, low-caste Indians, are being treated horribly. And if the economy for the middle-class people who are thus far ignored these issues around the social periphery, which in India is larger than the centre, if we're talking about economics, once the economy starts to have a downturn, and I believe over the next year, year and a half it will, and once people get increasingly fed up and agitated, we're going to see a lot of internal strife. And one thing to look out for specifically is next year in 2020, the Sikhs of Indian Punjab are set to hold a referendum, democratic, peaceful referendum on self-determination, just as the Scots have the right to do, just as the Catalans should have the right to do, just as anyone in the world should have the right to do. If India crushes that referendum under the force of violence, we're going to see, I think, much more consternation and many more challenges to the hegemony of the BJP from within than we've previously seen.
Thanks, Max, for the call. Vincent is in South Wales. Go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, thank you very much, George. I'd like to agree with Adam in respect to...
Can you turn your radio down, Vincent, yeah? Turn your radio down, because we're getting feedback.
Okay, sorry about that, right.
Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
Anyway, I agree in principle with Adam on this, and that is the 3 points...
Can we stop this one? Because it's impossible. We're hearing it. We're hearing everything twice. Try and get back to Vincent if you can, and talk him through the need to turn your radio down. So the telephone number for people is, if you're in the UK, 02077 982 255, and if you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Lots of Twitter questions for you, Adam. Marie McFarlane, my old friend up in Scotland, says, Adam, what do you think of the recent dumping of Boeing by China and its return to the gold standard in replacing the dollar?
Well, first of all, China has not gone on the gold standard at all. What they are doing is they're buying gold and lots of it, which could just be a long-term, and I mean very long-term, preparation for one day going on the gold standard. But right now, America is China's best customer. If China starts selling in gold and America starts buying it in its monopoly money painted on that green paper, that's not good for either side. But China's looking to the long term. China has a very hysterical culture, which is one of the reasons I'm a great admirer of it. Back to the Boeing issue, there's more to that than meets the eye. Right now, the trade war has gone from stick mode into carrot mode. The Chinese have started to buy more U.S. agricultural products as a gesture of goodwill, and Trump has reciprocated by delaying the onset of further tariffs, which, if the next few rounds of trade talks go well, may, I stress may, not even be necessary. The Boeing thing is a sword with two ends. On the one hand, there are very serious concerns about this Boeing 737 MAX jet that has had multiple fatal crashes in a very short period of time. I personally wouldn't get on one of those planes if asked to do so at an airport. So there's the safety issue, which is very real, and China's in the capacity to buy planes from whomever they want. They're the second richest country in the world, going on the first. Then there's the subtext. If a trade deal is done, China can then say, well, look, if you don't want to give us a good deal, we're going to go to Monsieur Macron and Frau Merkel and talk about Airbus purchases. But as part of the trade deal, Boeing could get rehabilitated, so to speak, in the Chinese market. So there's a lot going on there. Boeing's down, not necessarily out for good.
Out. Vincent is back on the line from South Wales. Go ahead, Vincent.
Yeah, thank you very much, George. Yeah, in relation to no deal at the end of October, I think there are three key points that may well be in the quiver of Boris's English bow. The first one is that EU law is considered a higher status than UK law whilst we are a member of the EU. The second point is the royal prerogative is important and relative in respect to foreign treaties stroke Article 50. And the third point is the Bill of Rights 1689 within our common law constitution is still law in the land, and these three factors can be used to combat the coup in Parliament through the Hillary Benn bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. Adam, you've dealt with one of those points already, the prerogative one, but the other two?
Well, sadly, EU law is superior to UK law. That's one of the reasons Brexit is important.
That's one of the reasons why we voted to leave.
I'd like a bit of English law back. Call me old-fashioned. I think the common law served very well from the time of Hastings up to 1973 when Mr. Heath fiddled about on his organ. Sorry, Mr. Heath. But getting back to the third point, again, I'm roasting David Cameron because his
book is out.
His book is out, available at all good pigsties the land over.
We'll review it next week if we can.
Quite so.
David Cameron, the Norfolk pig farmer.
Indeed. And he was saying when he was Prime Minister that we need a Bill of Rights in this country. There is one. So I don't know if the man was just stupid or pig-headed or what.
Pig-headed? Wouldn't mention pig-heads and David Cameron in the same radio broadcast. Not live, at least. Go ahead.
Well, I think we're into the quadruple entendre territory now. But you're absolutely right. The Bill of Rights gives certain privileges of representation to the people. It promoted the idea that one can petition Parliament. And this was an age before universal suffrage, but the foundations of having a Parliament representative of the people as opposed to one that simply follows some foreign diktat or some royal diktat. It's all in there, and it's very important, and it should be invoked. It will be invoked, I'm sure, if this goes before the Supreme Court, which it will. But then there's this other question that is far more banal than all this high-minded talk of constitutionality. Boris keeps talking about wanting a deal. And when he says a deal, he doesn't mean the straightforward free trading agreement that I want, that I think you want, that Mr. Farage wants, that most people on the Brexit side would want, that maybe even Tony Benn would have wanted. You know, I can't speak for him. He wasn't necessarily a big exponent of free trade, but nor was he one of these stupid isolationists. He knew all about the 1930s and the economic stupidity there on all sides. If Boris tries to ram May's bill through Parliament by reheating it minus the backstop, and it passes...
Or with a backstop called something else.
Quite right, that's very possible. Then we could see a betrayal, not of the Constitution, not of questions of royal prerogative versus parliamentary sovereignty, but we could have Brino, Brexit in name only. And then there's the other complicated issue. If the EU agreed to such a bad deal, and Boris tries to get it through Parliament and it fails, then we're sort of back to square one with a standoff between royal prerogative
it would
and the rest of
likely
it.
fail, wouldn't it? Because the DUP would not support it. The hardline half of the ERG wouldn't support it. Labour and Liberal and Nationalists wouldn't support it because they don't want any kind of Brexit. Or you think they might cross the floor?
I mean, not for me to call them dishonest and hypocritical, but I think...
Liberal Democrats?
Well, how
dishonest?
many... I mean, most people who were in the party weren't even in the party a few months ago.
They've got more Tory MPs than they have Liberal Democrat MPs now sitting in the Liberal Democrats.
I mean, the whole thing is so surreal.
They've got a guy now who 4 weeks ago was running to be the leader of the Conservative Party. He's now a Liberal Democrat MP. How many MPs in the British Parliament today are in the same party they were when they were elected to the British Parliament just 2 years ago?
It's extraordinary.
I mean, I don't know the number, but I've lost count of it.
I mean, the Liberal Democrats have become so green, they're recycling members of Parliament now. But so getting back, I certainly think that the ERG, at least most of them, this hardline Brexit faction of the Tory party, without whom Johnson couldn't govern at all, they would reject it. I would think that some Labour would reject it, most Liberals would reject it, the Nationalists would reject it, but if enough Labour MPs jumped on board as a way to get this out of the way so they could safely throw Corbyn off the Titanic before anyone's looking, they could vote for this Brino deal.
Well, they had plenty of chances to do it. They had 3 chances to do it, and there was never more than a dozen of them, usually 7, 8, 9 of them, voted for Theresa May's deal. It depends. Do they hate Corbyn more than they hate the Theresa May deal? Do they want Tom Watson to be their leader? Do they want John McDonnell to be their leader? There are all kinds of variables.
Quite so.
There's a legend on the line. It's the legend that is Norma in Bristol. Norma, welcome back to the show. Go ahead.
Hello, George. Hello, Adam.
Evening, Norma.
Actually, I just wanted to say it was so sad, that John Shipton interview with Julian. Yeah, but it was really, well, I thought it was unbelievable.
Yeah.
But my contribution, I've still got an echo.
No, you're addressing the world now. It's no longer just a country. There's people all over the world listening to you right now, beautifully.
Well, I'm an internationalist.
Yeah.
My contribution seems to pale into significance, really, from that John Shipton one. But
no.
I wanted to ask Adam, last night of the proms, there are some lovely programmes throughout the season, but the last 45 minutes, I never watched. I just put it on and switch off. It upsets me because they have Rule Britannia, and then you have the lovely music of Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance, but I hate the Land of Hope and Glory and Mightier, Yet I'm Mightier. And do we really need the national anthem? And then they pop balloons in the audience when the music's going on, which is bad-mannered. All I liked was Auld Lang Syne at the end. I just wondered what Adam thought.
Yeah, you know, I think Land of Hope and Glory is the most glorious and beautiful tune.
Tune?
If we were to make it our national anthem, we'd need to change the words.
Exactly.
But the tune itself is sublime,
Beautiful.
I think.
Yeah.
Adam, over to you. It's your field more than mine.
Well, I think that Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance March and the lyrics of Land and Hope and Glory are fine, just the way they are. There's actually Vera Lynn sings it beautifully. You can see that online. I love all the musical compositions. I have no problem with at all. I think they're great. The problem I had with the last night of the proms last night was that provocateurs passed out for free EU flags to just about everyone in the audience.
Why was that allowed? I mean, they knew it was going to happen. It's happened every year for the last few.
And not only was it allowed, but the BBC cameras never stopped focusing on them. There was even one man who appeared to be carrying with him a balloon phallus capped with some sort of EU insignia. Disgraceful, frankly. And I just thought, on a night that's supposed to be about a national celebration with British composers and international audiences, I don't have any problem with people bringing flags from all over the world, as they always have, because that's what music's about. Music's about sharing one culture with another and then seeing where it goes after that. That's absolutely wonderful. But to bring an overtly political symbol, for example, if there was someone carrying a Brexit Party flag or a UKIP flag or a Labour flag or a Tory flag, that would have been considered controversial. The EU flag, though, is a political symbol, especially with what's going on right now. And I just think that was disgraceful. But the music itself, give me Elgar and Rule Britannia over the more modern stuff any day.
Norma, last word to you.
It's just, I'm an internationalist. I like music from all over the world. I don't like pushing our country up like Rule Britannia and Mightier Yet and Mightier. I don't like it.
All countries have songs that talk about how great they are. But we can be international in our musical taste, which I certainly am, and still respect that all countries talk about their own real or perceived greatness in their national music.
And, of course, we could have gone out with John Lennon, a working-class hero from our own land. We could have gone out with him singing, "All we are saying is give peace a chance." Now, mind you, Ringo wouldn't have been popular there. I forgot about our controversy on Ringo. They were trying to drum him out of the brownies this week. Thanks, Norma. Last call, I think, will be from Heath in Daytona Beach. Go ahead, Heath. Daytona Beach is in California, I'm guessing. No, Florida.
No, no, it's Florida.
It's warm. It's sunny anyway. Go ahead.
Thank you, George. So I just wanted to make the comment that people are consistently saying, politicians and mainstream media, that everybody is tired of Brexit and they're tired of not getting forward. And I just wanted to put out there that I disagree with that. I'm highly active on Twitter and Facebook and other social media. And I believe that people are more engaged in democracy than at any time that I've been alive. And I think that the next stage of this, having watched the Brexit constituency win the argument consistently, that we need more democracy, not less.
Oh, yeah.
And I would like to know your thoughts on making the case for the next referendum that we need in the United Kingdom is to move our political system towards a proportional representation system.
Well, I've supported that all my life, even when I was the beneficiary of its alternative, its undemocratic alternative, which is the voting system that we now have. I personally lobbied both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, when they had the power and the majority to do so, to introduce proportional representation, which is fair votes, fair representation. And that was when I would not myself have benefited from it. So clearly, now that I would benefit from it, I'm just as enthusiastic about it. It is entirely wrong that a party that I wouldn't have voted for, ever, UKIP, can get millions of votes, but no MPs. And a party that gets 30% or less of the popular vote in the country could end up with a parliamentary majority, depending on how the chips fall. So I have an old-fashioned view, which is that the Parliament should directly reflect the proportion of votes cast in the country. That would place me on the Israeli side of the proportional representation system. But there are other systems. Other systems are available. There's the one in Scotland, the additional member system. There's the D'Hondt system, by which our delegation to the European Parliament is elected. But I prefer pure proportional representation. If you get 10% of the votes in the country, you should get precisely 10% of the seats in the Parliament. Adam, over to you.
Yeah, I agree. I believe in proportional representation. There's nothing sacred about the way in which MPs are elected, which a lot of people don't get. It changed in a bigly way, to quote Trump, in 1832, again in 1867, again in the 1880s, then 1918, and even as recently as the Attlee government, when the loss of the multi-member MP constituencies were abolished. It's constantly evolving. So can I just say, I quite like the way that the EU Parliament gets elected with their proportional representation. You like how the Israeli Parliament gets elected. So I think I'm going to have to ring one of the tabloids, because for the first time in history, I'm agreeing with something to do with the European Union, and you're agreeing with something to do with Israel. But so we're generally in agreement, though, on that. But getting to the other point, I'm absolutely in favour of more democracy, more referenda, and more free speech. I can't stress that enough. But I think that our friend calling in might be a bit overly optimistic. In a traditional totalitarian or oligarchic state, free speech is silenced the old-fashioned way, under a jackboot, in the gulag. What we have here is people are generally allowed to talk and talk on Facebook and Twitter and the rest of it.
Until people start listening to them.
Indeed. And they won't let them get near the elites. And there is a change in the air. The winds of change are blowing, but the old liberal elite aren't gone yet. So I think we need to remember that while Twitter and Facebook are a good way to get voices heard, it's still a digital make-believe world. If that doesn't translate into the ballot box and into the wider parliament of ideas in society, then it's more of a sideshow than anything else.
Last word quickly to you, Heath.
I think if we have more of the proportional representation, we will lose these hyperbolic campaigns that target 1 or 2 or 10 marginal constituencies that swing elections.
Yeah, quite so. And that is a very negative thing. Thanks for that call from Florida, from, I infer, an Englishman about the UK's voting system, which tells you something about this mother of all talk shows. Clever people are listening to us all over the world. It really is a global university, and I'm grateful to everyone that called in, everyone that sent in tweets and other messages. I'm sorry if we didn't get to yours, but the good news is we'll be back here, God willing, at the same time, same place next week. A number of people are asking, why can't we do more of these shows? We're very grateful to RT and to Sputnik for the show that we have. It's a big operation. It's quite an expensive operation, much more big and much more expensive than the old inferior local radio versions of the show. So I wouldn't dream of asking them to do it all again midway through the week, for example. But there are breaking news stories often that I would like to comment on. And I do a short 4-minute video for RT every Monday, which comes out on a Tuesday. I also do a weekly column for RT.com, which I write on a Tuesday and which is published on a Wednesday. So there are plenty of opportunities on Facebook, on Twitter, to keep abreast of what I'm saying, what I'm thinking, and you can follow both Adam and me on Twitter and, in my case, on Facebook and on Instagram even, Snapchat even. So it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you. My thanks to all my friends through the glass, busy like a beehive it is, with very clever young people doing their very best to bring you what I think is the best show on radio. It's must-see radio. Spread the word, won't you, about it.